thank all of you for going a nice walk in the crisp wind to come and listen about a really important topic. And I love the little twist in the program, which it says I'm going to talk about how to rebuild by design, not just about the rebuild by design process. So I plan to do that. I hope I do it well. As Harriet said last evening to several of us, I too am not Hank. He is bald. He is very Dutch. He's an excellent dancer, although we share that, and a great karaoke singer and a charismatic leader. So I know at some point as we continue this work in resilience that you will have Hank before you and he will mesmerize you with his stories. The advantage for you is I get to tell the story my way. And I hope I can shed some light differently than he does because I participated in Rebuild by Design in several ways. I met members of the White House Task Force through ULI at an early conference we gave. They introduced me to Hank and he asked me if I would serve as one of the advisors to the competition. I had almost said yes when he sent me the RFP to look at, and I said, oh my gosh, this is way too good for Penn Design. I cannot take us out of this competition. We have to compete. Then for a host of reasons, he prevailed on me again, and I became a special advisor, and I worked with each of the teams. So I'm going to personalize this a little bit to that experience and tell you more about the substance of what went on in the teams, and I'm going to do it as fast as I can, so hopefully there'll be time for questions. So with that, Rebuild by Design is an experience that changed the way we think about water, physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, vulnerability, risk, the relationship between and among governments, the relationships between government and community, the commitment to invest, on what terms and why. It not only gave permission to think beyond the usual political boundaries, it required thinking in the long term about the terms of human and capital investment to build back better. The lessons we are still learning include the importance of the regional scale, the specificity of individual place within the region, accepting uncertainty, valuing risk, building social resilience and collective alliances, gaining continuity and long-term stewardship for investment and return, and I'm an architect, true to my colors, changing the roles that design plays and can play. So that's my opportunity to pull out a snapshot of Hank. We were in New Orleans on a roof. As part of some research we were doing, we had one of those wonderful drones where you put your iPhone and send it up in the air. And so we were all entranced by waving. We traveled in a pack, we traveled many places, we learned to trust each other, and while we were teams who were still, in a sense, competing with each other, we came to understand that the opportunity we, the 10 teams, had was to help each other so that more teams, rather than fewer teams, would win. And I guess I was going to say, all my years in the Skidmore Partnership, I was always told that the A in architecture was for art. And I hope to persuade you today that the A in architecture is for action. So as for Rebuild by Design, this is October 29th, 2012, at night. In a sense, Storm Sandy really started it all. Storm Sandy illuminated the risk, woke us up to the facts, regardless of the cause, led to executive actions by the president, including the creation of the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. Their report of August 2013 contained 48 recommendations, of which the Rebuild by Design competition was either number 5 or 6 or 7, and it led to Rebuild by Design. As the clouds finally parted, Storm Sandy revealed the vulnerabilities and interdependencies across the New York, New Jersey, Long Island, Connecticut region in a strange new light. At various scales, regional, neighborhood, the personal home, the personal point where you got enough electricity sharing with your neighbors so you could communicate with the world for 20 or 30 minutes a day. As much as we think and speak globally, this is very personal stuff. It's people's homes, it's people's lives. It is a time of a strong sense of personal and family vulnerability. For days, information is scarce, fuel supplies dwindle, power, if present, is limited, it's cold, it's raining again, the structure of work and school is not there, cash machines don't work, it is not the moment for decision making. But that leads to this rather disturbing chart, and one of the things that we need to understand, which is how do we alter this phenomenon? Because once we pass through the period of intense personal vulnerability, then recovery, both individual and collective, can begin. But as we get further in time from the event, the sense of need for fundamental change diminishes. We may think it won't happen again, but most likely we are wrong. We need to stay focused on that vulnerability. And for a moment, occasionally, I'm going to call out a couple of things that our team at Penn Design contributed to the conversation, and this was one of the early ones. In writing the proposal, you had to say you were really great. You had to do all those things we usually did, you know, put together the right team, show that you were thinking cross-disciplinary, you had the right experience, which none of us really had the right experience for innovative design, to rebuild by design. But it became clear, even in the days when we were putting the proposal together, that vulnerability and understanding vulnerability was key. So right after the event, as I was saying, it's the people who are vulnerable. In time, that sense of vulnerability takes on larger threats. And we at Penn decided to put together this list in our proposal to be selected for Rebuild by Design. There are 4 vulnerabilities that we identified. The first is that significant population will continue to grow, will occur on a smaller and more volatile landmass, meaning that there is a high cost of some risk and many people stay in harm's way. Secondly, that large-scale hard infrastructure solutions introduce new vulnerabilities in a couple of ways. If you block the floodwater, you transfer the risk upstream. But also, if you build hard infrastructure that removes the pleasure of sliding your way down to the beach, you've created an economic vulnerability for tourist-driven towns. So the challenges that hard infrastructure causes among them are in fact creating new vulnerabilities. Here's one that I think we all worry about. Government's capacity to fund and finance rebuilding efforts is declining relative to the risks we're facing and the potential exposures. And lastly, lack of consensus about steps and investments will erode our own individual and collective commitment to adapt and to build momentum. There's a lot to say about each of those, but they're pretty serious. So I found this quote from Gabe Metcalf of Spur, which raises this problem of diminishing momentum. He says, among other things, what do we do when we don't really believe it, when the evidence isn't completely at hand? We put it out of our minds most of the time. In fact, we struggle to come to terms with living in uncertainty. And just as Rebuild by Design was beginning, the International Panel on Climate Change was preparing to issue its next report. I think it was the 3rd report. In August of 2013, Justin Gillis of the International Herald Tribune wrote, "The new report also reiterates a core difficulty that has plagued climate and science for decades. While averages for such measures as temperatures can be predicted with some confidence on a global scale, the coming changes still cannot be forecast reliably on a local scale." He pointed out this can leave governments and businesses fumbling in the dark as they try to plan. For Rebuild by Design, it was more personal and more immediate. There were a group of architects who suddenly had a task to do, no site, no program, no client. Now, how many of you are architects, designers, planners, and so forth, right? We're pretty dependent on clients, program, and site, but we're also saying to each other, why don't they invite us in earlier so we can help shape the problem? Well, I have to say, among very many distinguished people, there was a month of mind spinning to figure out what it meant to have an opportunity to do that. And of course, what it means is you have a chance to frame the question. You have an opportunity to enter into dialogue with scientists who sometimes cannot find the implication of their own fantastic conclusions. And they, in turn, can begin to inform us about how to limit or pen in the uncertainty that we are experiencing, which is making it hard for us to proceed. And of course, the other thing designers can do is they can help with envisioning and making us see what scientists are predicting. Again, it doesn't matter whether the average sea level rise around the world is exactly what's going to hit here in 2020 or 2030 or 2050, but rather learning to get in our heads that there are new realities coming our way if we don't do something about it. So debating whether climate change exists is no longer relevant. Regardless of the rate of change, we need to ask. And the inadequacy of predictions cannot be a reason for failing to act. And act is what President Obama did. He visited the devastation, bonded with Governor Chris Christie, and moved ahead. On December 7th, 2012, he signed an executive order establishing the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. Knowing that I was going to mention that, I was quite amused by this morning about putting things through the prism of congressional wisdom. Thank goodness for executive orders, at least sometimes. And just 6 months later, the White House issued the President's Climate Action Plan. It contained a series of executive actions to reduce carbon pollution, prepare the U.S. for the impacts of climate change, and lead international efforts to address global climate change. And 2 months after that, the Rebuilding Task Force issued the Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Strategy. Jumping ahead for a moment, on June 26th, exactly a year after the anniversary of the Climate Action Plan, at the League of Conservation Voters, the President emphasized that the work is urgent now due to the rapidly growing threat. You cannot ignore the facts. You can ignore the facts. You can't deny the facts, he said. And the rest of his quote is here, and I think it's very telling. This is not a political campaign on my part. It's just a telling comment. He goes on to say, so the question is not whether we need to act. The question is whether we have the will to act before it's too late. So before I go further into Rebuild by Design, I have to admit that it's not possible to tell the RBD story without referring to the Dutch, and not just because of Henk. Too often, we've heard the stories of the Dutch, and we associate the Netherlands with a commitment to beautiful, functional, and high-performance hard infrastructure that is funded and maintained by the government. But so now our story, the Rebuild by Design story, heads back to the future, to Holland. And the story is indeed somewhat different. Secretary Sean Donovan had been named the chair of the Hurricane Sandy Task Force. On his way with his family to Berlin for the holidays, he stopped in Holland. And as we of the community of Rebuild Design know well, he met Henk Ovink. One of the lessons of RBD is that in rebuilding, there is no copy-paste. But there are lessons to be learned internationally. Seeking talent and expertise, Secretary Donovan went to Holland. Because the Netherlands is, in Henk's words, made out of water. It is a center of trade across the oceans, of negotiations, crafts, and business innovations, of investments, of managing risks and uncertainties, as much through private investment strategies as through government investment, although there has been a lot of government investment too. The Netherlands are nearly crowded off the European continent by the fact that the Netherlands is the delta land for 4 major European rivers. 26% of its land area is below sea level, 29% above sea level but in the floodplain, and 59% in total at risk of flooding. As a result, as you know, it is the land of polders. A polder is a low-lying tract of land enclosed by dikes that forms an artificial hydrological entity. And the Netherlands has more than 3,500 of them, but then who's counting? This is a story most of us know, at least in general terms, but there's more to the story. Back in 1222, a group of farmers came together, already aware of the need for high productivity on each of their own farmlands. But under the threat of recurring flooding, they decided each needed to contribute some land to a mitigation scheme, to give up productive land for collective mitigation. The gifted land became the protected embankment that isolated the hydrological body. The process occurred over and over again over the centuries in many shapes and forms, not copy-paste, but in site-specific designs that have stood the test of time. And then something else happened. There was a devastating hurricane in 1953, an unusual event for Holland, which had long been dealing with seawater and seawater rise as its primary water threat. This story sets the stage for a fascinating lesson. Because of the hurricane, the country turned to solely engineering solutions and proposed and built a hard perimeter to hold the sea at bay. It created perimeter protection, all right, but it didn't deal with runoff. The snowmelt from the Alps flooded much of the eastern inland part of the country, and the Dutch realized they needed to do something different. The experience led them away from a sole focus on protection to a multi-tiered policy that also focused on land use planning and strong disaster management deployment. Engineering hardening to protect against one risk can create greater vulnerability to another risk. So the Dutch created the Delta Program, a new water authority with the jurisdiction to also plan to control land use planning on a regional scale in a framework based in law. Every part of that statement, which I have taken from Hank, is critical to understanding, if we're going to act regionally, what we are required to do. Instead of just analyzing past floods, the Commission pioneered conceptual modeling frameworks to use as the new norm for analyzing value and determining the return on investment. Major areas to protect are identified, cost of flooding is assessed, chances are calculated by statistical model, not just historical data, simulations are done, and it leads to the kind of discussion about cost-benefit trade-off that we often fail to have. So how many of you love cost-benefit analysis? We have to do it all the time. Byron, you've got to be the only person who does, because we also know two things about cost-benefit analysis. The larger the project, the less well it will do on a cost-benefit scale, and the more construction there is, as opposed to policy implementation, also the worst it will do in that analysis process. This new way of looking like insurance folks do at the risk of damage and what it could be can actually help us understand the relationship between that price and the probable damage, but more importantly, become the basis of community conversations which become more real. I'll have an example of that a little bit later on. So an important thing to know in closing about Back to the Future in Holland is that the cities of Holland and the lands of Holland, the people of Holland, understand that they live in a water culture. After the devastation of World War II, Rotterdam was heavily engineered and grew to be the largest port in Europe. In fact, between 1962 and 2002, it was the world's largest, although that's now been overtaken by Singapore and Shanghai. Water is the basis of culture as well as economy in Rotterdam. So here we are. What is Rebuild by Design? Rebuild by Design is a truly innovative competition, kind of akin to atonal music, not always seemingly well organized, but always trying to get to a particular, richer, better place for rebuilding. It had 4 parts. First, the competition. That was the application by the teams to be selected. Secondly, not design, but research, followed by not design, but civic engagement and alliance building, then design, and now implementation. It's a call for innovating together, to borrow from the Dutch in a new norm, through an emphasis on cross-disciplinary thinking and collective strategies at the geographic reach required to respond to the vulnerabilities of each location and each community. Design-led teams were invited to apply in a page-limited proposal that demonstrated their special commitment to fresh approaches to designing to build resilience. Earlier that spring, ULI had convened its first symposium on Storm Sandy, a meeting in Washington that brought together people skilled in risk assessment, insurance, and economic impacts. Task force staff attended that conference, and we got to know each other. I told you a little bit of this story before. I met Hank in June, and he asked if I would be an advisor, but a few weeks later, I got the RFP, and my heart leapt. It was too good to pass up. So Penn Design, teamed with the Olin Partnership, entered the competition. Sure, said Hank, that's fine, but do you really think you have a chance to win? It turned out that another 147 teams also thought they had a chance to be selected. It was a great turnout, a great validation for an idea of a really unusual, and it turned out to be incredibly unusual competition. The RFP had a page limit and a list of criteria, but otherwise wanted to know how you propose to bring innovation to age-old problems of increasing severity and threat. The key goals from among this long list, the key goal, the one that Hank always sings out the loudest, was to ignite innovation through regional collaboration. And the prize, very tempting, was possible funding from HUD's Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. By August 2014, Secretary Donovan and Hank had their teams in place. There were 10 of us in the talent column. On the right-hand side, for funding, Rockefeller Foundation took the point as a lead supporter, with other foundations joining as well. For process, that's the teams, or the talent. That's the coordinating groups. One academic center, NYU, and 3 remarkable civic institutions, the Municipal Arts Society, the Van Allen Institute, and the Regional Plan Association became collaborators, particularly in research directions, civic engagement, and partnering opportunities. Celebrating on that evening at NYU, we looked around and wondered what we were in for. It didn't take long to find out. Design as an activity would have to wait. For the time being, there was no site, no program, no specific client. We were going to do regional research, and we were going to do it not competitively, but together. That meant culling through work that others had done and were doing to find the data that would guide our future design work, to put the data together in visual form, to strike new chords and intersections of further exploration. This particular image was put together by one of the teams, SCAPE, and its goal was to demonstrate the rate of change across time for key factors in the increasing severity of threats and weather. So the factors include, and the steepest one is the growth in urban population, the increasing intensity of storms, the rise of sea level, and the increase in temperature. Not bad for taking a multi-page report and getting visual people engaged in it. Big put together hurricane tracks from 1980 to 2005. And they do not paint a comforting picture for America's eastern seaboard virtually all along its entire length. As often as not, we discovered, it is too little water rather than too much. From NYU's sociologists, we gained greater appreciation of the social and cultural impacts of severe storms and the disproportionate presence of lower income households in the areas most vulnerable to storm. We mapped, we mapped regional vulnerabilities as well, learning that 75% of the power generation stations in New York City and northern New Jersey are in the 100-year floodplain, and also that 80% of the region's liquid fuel storage is in that floodplain. We learned that design for physical resilience must be accompanied by an equal or perhaps even greater requirement for social resilience. And only when the overwhelming sense of vulnerability has passed can individuals and communities make informed decisions about their future. So here's a quick look at some work that we at Penn Design did with our colleagues in Community and Economic Development and Insurance and Risk at Wharton. Sorry about this. Storm Sandy made visible the link among physical, social, and economic vulnerability, pre-existing conditions that had been in formation for decades before October 2012. When you map the FEMA flood zones in dark blue, the storm surge in lighter blue, and the indicators of social vulnerability in orange, you can see the overlapping pattern that emerges, which led us to a hypothesis about two different community trajectories based on these underlying factors and overlaying conditions. The first trajectory is one in which concentrations of high-end housing are likely to have the means to self-insure or forgo new loans or mortgages. These communities have great potential for rebuilding, perhaps even when it may not be environmentally wise to do so. In the second trajectory, storm-vulnerable communities with concentrations of lower-income housing and industry may suffer decline when there is a capital flight to higher ground. This analysis, together with more site-specific investigations, allowed our team to identify 4 regional examples of places where both economic and social capital may be at risk of flight, but where an increase in long-term value was possible if regional risk reduction strategies could be put in place. These 4 categories would become our sites of study in the next RBD phase. And Hunts Point was one of them. So this is a quick example. Hunts Point, which is in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, at the end of the East River, where it turns and flows out to Long Island Sound, there is food supply for up to 20, the Hunts Point market supplies food for up to 22 million people in the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region. It has a 4-day supply on hand. Had the storm come a couple hours later, had its incidence been a little further to New York, to the north, it's entirely possible that this facility would have been closed. And at the same time, it's co-located with what is the lowest income congressional district in the entire United States. A great example of things that we need to do. 100% location for what we can do to rebuild by design. And what we discovered was we would then protect 20,000 jobs and a $5 billion annual economy by an investment that I will describe later on. So Rebuild by Design then became an effort to build alliances. This is the Lower East Side at one of their working sessions. And money's at stake, so you can be sure that New York's top leaders joined in on the Lower East Side as well. You know, it was kind of amazing that they actually all stood there on the platform next to each other. Our new mayor, our about to run for next term governor, and our really very good Senator Chuck Schumer. And in the alliances we had to build, there were also large numbers of agencies and ad hoc civic organizations. The objective of building alliances was to, the objective of the phase to form lasting alliances was to form lasting alliances that would be helpful in building the basis for HUD funding, who would be the grantee, as well as bringing to the table other public and private resources that would increase the scope and range of the Rebuild by Design projects. Even community meetings took innovative turns. There were many, many, many of them, and a few were specifically designed for outreach with the communities themselves. David Vandelair, director of the Van Allen Institute, helped the teams innovate in building interest and attention in these. In Hunts Point, where the small community near to the market voices strongly its sense of exclusion from the goods of the nearby meat, fish, and produce markets, the event was a slam bake. a competition among local chefs in the South Bronx to spotlight the importance of the food supply and its local as well as its regional availability. It was an absolutely great celebration. Aha, at last we get to design. 10 teams began their collaborative design work, each looking at multiple sites and scales, from which one would be selected in collaboration with Hank and the secretary and the other entities working with us for further direction. So the location stretched from Bridgepoint, Connecticut to Toms River, New Jersey, with Ashbury Park, Lake Union, Red Hook, Hoboken, the Meadowlands, Lower Manhattan, the Rockaways, Jamaica Bay, Long Island Sound, Hunts Point, and other locations in between. Interdisciplinarity started paying off. Disciplines and approaches were integrated. The landscape folks pursued broad landscapes, soft infrastructure, wetland restorations, and protective dunes. The architects could not resist the urge for the metaphor that protection for the high values of Manhattan could rise from the Battery itself. The urban designers identified the benefits of multi-purpose infrastructure that could protect industrial sites while also increasing access to the water and recreational values for community members. Strategies shared by neighboring cities where storm surge and flood innovation go hand in hand were really at the hands of the urban planners. And comprehensive strategies to, and an assessment of the capacity of your community. What work could they do? What work could they be engaged in? How could local human capital be a part of what we were proposing to do? We also looked at what kinds of projects would occur over time. Simple changes in material, planting dune grass first, furniture, rising to infrastructure, acting at the scale of the neighborhood, moving on to the city and the region, and even the mega region will take a progression across years and across times to accomplish. Here's to the point of some of the things that we were talking about this morning. We also had to do a proof of concept. And as I said before, conventional cost-benefit analysis really wasn't getting us where we wanted to go. So the work of the interdisciplinary teams in this phase also included the proof of a payback for the investment of public and private funds, a multiple of 4 shown here. And however you measure it, federal investment in disaster recovery and relief has been recently on the rise, and very dramatically. The Center for American Progress writes, we estimate that the federal government spent $136 billion total from 2011 to 2013 on disaster relief, which adds up to nearly $400 per US household per year. Now that might sound like a lot, or it might sound like a little, but the point is it sounds like an amount that we can address, talk about, and begin to bring into our personal and our community conversations about, is it worth it? Does it make a difference? Will we be more resilient when these investments are made? There was a lot of work on finance innovation. If Jamie Springer is here, he was one of the key people from HRNA making that happen. The teams and their economic advisors also explored innovative funding mechanisms, seeking ways to leverage dollars and attract capital from other players. And regional risk reduction became a shared objective. By April, just 8 months after team selection and thousands of person hours later, it was decision time. Each team presented its work to a jury of specialists, and the deliberations began. Senior staff from HUD reached out to assess capability of potential grantees and the level of support from elected officials. They asked, if we, the federal government, invest, will you invest too? The president remained strong. This was our First Lady speaking at a Cooper Hewitt benefit. Maybe someday there will be a president architect. And Sean Donovan came to make the announcement. The 6 winners are, and I should say something, we really did begin to get in the process of this that if anyone won, everyone won, and if more people won, then the program would be a greater success with greater chance of replicability and moving on to a national version of it, which Harriet Tregoning will speak with you about tomorrow. So SCAPE won for Living Breakwaters on Staten Island. UPenn Olin won for Hunts Point Lifelines in the Bronx. OMA won for Resist, Delay, Store, and Discharge in Hoboken. MIT teamed with the Dutch group, won for the New Meadowlands in New Jersey. Interborough won for Living with the River on Long Island's beautiful South Shore. And BIG won for the Big U in Lower Manhattan. We should say the teams didn't necessarily win the work. The teams won the grant, helped win the grant to a grantee who is now responsible for proceeding with these projects. So what are these projects? Very, very quickly. This will just be a very quick pass. So the Living Breakwater is an extensive dune and reef along the southern shore of Staten Island that will support a porous habitat to promote biodiversity, as well as becoming a first line of protection for Staten Island communities. And even as one increment of a possible larger ecological solution, it will do good without increasing the threat of harm to less protected area. Even more, though, it's a recreation resource and also a visible ecosystem laboratory that will be at the center of middle school education programs. Its visibility is at the heart of why it's a successful project. It makes risk visible to those who live, work, and study here. The Room for the River will address the Mill River on Long Island's South Shore as a means for controlling sediment and protecting the viability of the barrier islands. It will also allow the marshes to regain health and biodiversity. The Meadowlands is a large-scale regional framework that retains the essential logistics operation of this region-serving asset while concentrating new development rather than letting it sprawl, and at the same time restoring essential wetland areas. 3 pilot projects will be addressed in the initial stages of this project. The Hoboken project is a multi-layered, multi-agency investment strategy for addressing concurrent or sequential storm events, which hits hardest on the inland areas and inundate the city's lower-income neighborhoods and its sewage treatment plants. The interrelated systems protect against water surge from the river and the harbor, use green streets to retain accumulating water, then store that water until the river is low enough for the discharge systems to work. The first stage of investment in the Lower East Side will provide protective landscapes and inviting parklands to serve the Lower East Side communities, connecting people to water and creating place. The Hunts Point Lifelines offer edge protection, internal greenways, power supply, and access to maritime transport for use both during storm events and the aftermaths, as well as on an everyday basis. Further planning and possible pilot projects will create community assets for the neighborhood while also increasing certainty to stimulate private investment in the markets and nearby industry by design. Oh, sorry. So Hunts Point keeps the food supply going, is a mutual prosperity plan for the food industry and the community through the protection of living wage jobs, a strategy to create safe routes of connection for community life and the food economy, and new maritime connections as well. It builds on existing assets, which are cultivated oyster reefs, and it works with the train as well as trucking and water access to strengthen the market's ability to serve the entire region. So this was Rebuild by Design, launched June 20th, 2013. Winners selected June 2nd, 2014, and this is where we are now. The funds have been allocated, and the project is the transition in project leadership is beginning. Grantees must step up to clarify the work ahead and the team members required to move it forward. The commitment to innovation and the ability to implement remain at the forefront, but will they be realized when this goes back to more normal leadership, more bureaucratic agencies, and the whole process of grants, tours, and grantees? I'm optimistic. Will the broad engagement and the commitment to innovation and regional thinking be sustained? I hope so. And philanthropy, again led by the Rockefeller Foundation, is stepping in to help. Lessons learned. We always have to do lessons learned. I'll be brief. First lesson, the overarching theme that we came to is building or rebuilding water culture. A water culture exists where the conditions of vulnerability to water are understood and are seen as important factors in making decisions about where to live, where to invest, and even where and when to retreat. For years, people have chosen location and place because of schools, taxes, views, climate, walkability, and other factors. Why not water? Water in a different, more nuanced way, becoming more adaptive, more responsive to water, its presence, its absence, and its risks. Whoops. Second, risk reduction rather than perfect protection. Understanding vulnerabilities to assess risk, and understanding our personal and collective tolerance for living with risk, then taking decisions. This is the way we proceed. With a focus on risk reduction, the lack of reliability of fine-grained site-specific forecasts becomes less of a problem. You're not eliminating the risk, you're reducing it. Evaluating risk as a long-term recurring condition, which if not abated, will have future costs that can be estimated. Third, understanding the power of collective intelligence. Everyone matters. The scientist matters to the architect matters to the scientist, both matter to the sociologist. But everyone matters more when they know and believe that their point of view informs a broader collective intelligence. As an example, the startup of the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy at UPenn School of Design this fall had led us to appreciate the goal of this is energy policy, not energy research. That one of the important things to stress is communication. As the future director of that center said to me, we don't need more writers and researchers, we need more readers learning what this research is telling us and putting it to action. Collective intelligence and a shared narrative that addresses tolerance for risk are the fundamental characteristics of social resilience. Regional thinking is essential, but it is very hard and maybe impossible to achieve without regional authority. What do I mean by that? We need regional authorities that are transparent, accountable, and capable of action, empowered to act, not just advising on action, as in the Dutch Delta program. Despite this hurdle, this radical change of thinking, we must think and act regionally. And finally, the best ideas, they may be innovative, they may be creative, they may be practical, they may be pushing the limit of experiment, are those that are based on an understanding of local conditions and risks, the ones that build on community capacity and gain broad support that indicates real potential for implementation across an extended period of time, and also attract the strong possibility of participation by additional investors. In the Rebuild by Design proposals, the ones who were seen to be best were the ones that rose to the top. So we've come a long way from New Orleans. We've got a long way to go. And it takes us back to President Obama's comment. We can ignore the facts, but we can't deny them. This image, prepared by NOAA, and at least noted on by NOAA, says the following in the tiny little type. This image shows 10 indicators of a warming world. According to NOAA, 7 indicators would increase in a world that was warming, and those 7 indicators are increasing. 3 indicators would decrease in a warming world, and those indicators are decreasing. 10 for 10, it's time to act. Thank you very much. So, huh? Oh, no. I was just going to say, we have some options here. I'd be very happy to take questions. If you have pressing questions, please feel free to come up to the mic. We are but a few steps and 2 escalator rides away from a wonderful reception where we will have a chance to talk not just about this, but other days as well. Any questions that you would like to bring up right now? Could you go to the mic, please? And just for the record, tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Christopher Callett. I'm at UC Berkeley in the Department of Architecture. You started with New Orleans and ended with New Orleans. I'm curious about any lessons learned or why you even included New Orleans, because your approach was completely different than anything that happened post-Katrina.
I think I call it learning from New Orleans. For those of you who remember back that far, one of the first things that happened to me when I became chairman of ULI is that Katrina hit, and we went off to New Orleans. And it was way too early to be there. We made extraordinary recommendations. It was one of the super panels. We had a bad bank. We were buying back housing. And it was deeply, deeply misunderstood. And so without emphasizing that, my reason for including it and sort of ending with it is that I think we need to remember the importance of social resilience, the benefits of time, but in particular, also not to lose that crest in momentum completely as we begin to believe maybe things will go back to normal when in fact they don't. So it's a personal piece, and it's also a great example of the way, and I credit Hank, that he built a team of people who were eager to travel together, work together, learn together, as we did very well. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Will Travis.
Hey, Will.
It seems to me that the magic here is you had a president committed to action, a charming and articulate Dutchman, Congress willing to commit $1 billion to projects that had not been designed, envisioned, or even thought about, and OMB blinked. Do you think it's possible for that to happen again?
That's a great question, and one that we're spending a lot of time on now as I begin to become special advisor. And if I may add one thing, Will, the specific designation of DR CDBGs, disaster recovery CDBG, community development block grants, for which the criteria were far more effectively, I don't want to say ambiguous, but broad, because there's not literally a housing unit being funded here, but there's a lot of urban development going on. And had it gone through a different allocation process in a more normal channel, that would have been different. It would have been difficult. Secretary Donovan had great discretion. He did all of his political homework in Washington and in the localities, but he himself had great discretion about how he could use those funds. Do I think those things happen again? I don't know. There's something, our energies become attracted to something when we think we're doing something new. We're drawn to the opportunity to be innovators, to look at things differently, to bring teams of people together in different ways. And how many times you can do that, I don't know. But I am proud to see that Harriet has jumped in on the national program that's coming up, and she is writing her own innovative process. The trick is getting the talent engaged in the process and hoping that it then is good enough that it becomes the justification for the next. But I will tell you, there's the equivalent of that momentum chart saying, why do we have to do it so innovatively? Wouldn't it just be easier if we used the standard contracts? And I think it's incumbent on all of us to put on our community hats at that moment and be emphatic that we are willing to engage in this new process because we see its benefits.
Thank you, Marilyn. I want to ask you, I was concerned about the regional authority part. I was wondering if you had any good advice for regional authority, maybe from what you learned from Rebuild by Design.
You know, I am privileged to live in two cities where the regional authorities we have, where the regional bodies we have gain their authority by years of continuous good work and engagement in the problems of the region of the scale. So we have the Delaware River Valley regional entity. It's set in law, but it doesn't have a big array of specific powers. It has to be a convincer of the ideas that it puts out. And in fact, as most of you know, in New York, we have one of the oldest, if not the oldest, regional authority that has not, a regional planning association that has not a shred of legal ability to implement a single thing it says, and yet they're very effective. We're struggling right now because one of the hardest things to change is to get governmental agencies to give up the real meaning of borders. The clearest example of this, how many of you are familiar with New Jersey and go down the shore? I had never been down the shore. And it is the same problem over and over and over again. They're wonderful little towns. They've each built protective dunes in one form or another. They have backwater lakes that collect the water, which is then released into the sea when the ocean is low enough to let it flow. The biggest threat to the New Jersey communities right at the shore is not the ocean right now. It is the upland development in the adjoining county, which is consuming porous surface, not replacing it, not thinking about absorbing, detaining, retaining, holding onto, and slowly releasing the water. So even as little as an inch of rain overnight slides downstream, is held in the lakes because it can't be released at high tide, and floods the basement and the first floor of inland housing in community after community after community after community. That should be easy, right? State of New Jersey, make them talk to each other. The boundaries remain. They're intractable. And so that leads me to say it's very important that we start thinking in terms of regional authorities that are created in law, that have some of the powers that redevelopment agencies have for land planning, for assembling land for purpose, but that they are also structured to be accountable to all of us. And that isn't something we have in profusion in the United States. So we're going to have to learn from the Dutch. We're going to have to learn from the Singaporeans. We're going to have to learn from others why regional problems have to be addressed with commensurate regional powers reportable to the voters.